Chapter 3. The First Death. Published by Royal Road. For a single, horrifying instant, Tekiel felt an anguish so intense it seemed every fragment of his soul had been torn in half. Holy shit, what the hell was that? When he opened his eyes, he was no longer in the physical world. He found himself floating in some kind of spectral plane while staring, horrified, at the pieces that remained of his body scattered across the courtyard of the Temple of Light. Arms, legs, viscera, a jigsaw puzzle no one would ever want to assemble. It wasn't a pretty sight. Disgusting. And to think my first death would be this humiliating. Tekiel scanned the scene around him with disgust. His system interface was flooded with giant, pulsating, aggressive red letters. You died. No kidding. Stupid system. If you hadn't told me, I never would have realized I died. Tekiel huffed with sarcasm while glaring at the painfully obvious message flashing on the screen. Below it, another message appeared. You are already at the Temple of Light. Please wait 30 seconds for resurrection. Tekiel rolled his eyes but complied. Staying in place seemed to be standard procedure anyway, and since the temple was the respawn point, he was already where he should be. As the precious seconds dripped by like honey, he began to reflect. What the hell went so wrong that I turned myself into an arcane barbecue? After a few moments of bitter pondering, the most likely answer finally hit him. It must have been some kind of weird reaction, wrong arcane flow. I bet I screwed up one of the fireball nodes. Damn. He finally realized that he had turned the fireball skill into a sort of corpse explosion simply by channeling arcane energy incorrectly through 2 or 3 nodes that looked perfectly fine. Rookie mistakes. Veteran level explosions. When the countdown hit 0, his body materialized again in a burst of intense light. The spectral form faded, and Tekiel returned to the same courtyard he had arrived in minutes before, whole, alive, and at least somewhat decent. In the distance, Vrmmo Calistius had witnessed everything. First, he saw the mortal remains of the Champion of Light vanish suddenly as if they were an illusion. Then, only a few seconds later, he saw the same man appear out of nowhere, reborn in a pure burst of brilliance. The acolyte's eyes widened. Unsure whether he should run, cry, or scream, he dropped to his knees, pressing his forehead against the white stones of the temple. The light, it revived its champion. He raised his hands, worshipping the miracle before him. To him, it was absolute proof. The goddess never failed. The light always prevailed. As soon as he finished materializing, Tekiel received one last system message. The goddess of light has brought you back to life. He sighed, brushing imaginary dust from his chest. No one can ever know about this. Tekiel whispered to himself. He would never forget that ridiculous death. Fortunately, no one seemed to have noticed his sudden explosion into a corpse, since the courtyard was empty. Tekiel immediately resumed his training, though this time he chose something a little less explosive. Arcane Attraction, Magic Level 1. Assists in the continuous replenishment of arcane energy through environmental absorption. Surely it had to be nearly impossible to die by exploding while using a skill meant to absorb ambient arcane energy, even if he made a mistake. Thinking back, starting with Fireball had indeed been incredibly stupid. Tekiel instantly recalculated his entire mindset toward the game. This wasn't a normal game. The mentality he carried over from other games simply didn't apply here. Yes, there were familiar elements, but it took only one death for Tekiel to realize this game had been developed with brutality in mind. If a simple level 1 spell could cause such a catastrophic reaction, it meant far worse things awaited him. Tekiel actually found that exciting. From what he could tell, the game's essence was extremely deep and punishing. Eventually, he sat down and began examining the nodes of the Attraction Arcana skill. Their arrangement was even more complicated than those of the lesser Fireball. What the hell is this? Tekiel couldn't help complaining. There were far more nodes here than in lesser Fireball. He stopped whining and focused on memorizing the nodes' positions. Their arrangement resembled a kind of vortex. It was far more intuitive than Fireball, which seemed almost random at first glance. Still, it wasn't like he could master everything easily. Tekiel spent several minutes testing the limits of what he could do with the different nodes of Attraction Arcana. Crap, he muttered, clutching his head as a throbbing pain pulsed through it after he activated a few wrong nodes again. Thankfully this time there was no explosion. Only a bit of blood trickled from his nose, dripping onto the courtyard floor. That was far more acceptable than being blown up alive every time he messed up. This is really hard, he thought after several painful attempts. Only someone with a photographic memory could remember all these nodes without messing up. It was far from simple. He couldn't just keep his eyes fixed on the illustrated nodes in the book. The moment he opened his eyes, his mental focus wavered, and the base circle with the central node collapsed, triggering a chain reaction in his mind. What kind of crappy magic system is this? Tekiel wondered. What kind of masochist was Mordenkainen? There was nothing easy about this system. Eventually, Tekiel began pacing around the empty courtyard while continuously visualizing the nodes of attraction arcana. It couldn't just be this. It was far too difficult to execute a skill like this. Honestly, it seemed completely impossible. It was already complicated to take the first steps while standing still, let alone in the middle of a fight. Tekiel couldn't help questioning whether this system was even functional. After a few minutes of deliberation, he sat down again in the center of the courtyard and continued studying the nodes of attraction arcana. Their vortex-like configuration was by far the easiest to understand among all the models he had at the moment. Whether he liked it or not, this was the skill he would need to stick with, since it was definitely the simplest. Then, suddenly, an idea came to him. Instead of executing the ability node by node, he tried something different. Since the nodes formed a vortex, Tekiel immediately associated attraction arcana with the image of a vortex itself. He attempted to activate the ability in his mind using that single associated image. It was like looking at a constellation in the night sky, not star by star, but as a whole. It was much easier to understand everything when seen as a complete shape rather than piece by piece. To Tekiel's surprise, the idea worked, somewhat. A strange, glowing blue vortex about 10 meters wide manifested with him at its epicenter. It immediately began pulling in particles of arcane energy that floated invisibly through the atmosphere. As they entered the vortex's range, they became visible. Unfortunately, it lasted only a few seconds before his mental image wavered due to a momentary distraction. Tekiel instantly felt the headache caused by abruptly interrupting the ability incorrectly. His nose began to bleed again, but this time he wore a satisfied smile. Tekiel repeated the same visualization technique to execute attraction arcana. It was getting easier each time. His arcane energy bar was already full, since he had barely managed to spend any of the energy he had stored. He couldn't yet tell how effective the absorption was until he managed to empty at least part of his reserves. Finally, Tekiel decided to keep attraction arcana active as long as possible without faltering. It was difficult, but at least it wasn't impossible like Lesser Fireball. Wait, a sudden spark of realization crossed his mind. Why can I see arcane energy part?